You want me to start?
Sure.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We're super excited. This year was a very hard-earned year in the brand trust department, and we're excited to share with you our latest installment of the 2023 Brand Trust Report, which is all about the collapse of the purchase funnel. Anything you want to add to that?
Well, first of all, to say we've done this now for 8 years for Cannes. There are 2 or 3 very important findings for this year. The first is that the purchase funnel doesn't work because purchase is just the beginning. That, in fact, if you don't have a relationship and if you don't have follow through on commitments that are arguably historically in the realm of corporate sustainability or diversity, you're not going to get the second purchase. That's really important, number one. Number two is that, in fact, there's 2 completely separate groups to think about. Those who believe in institutions, those who believe in experts, and those who don't. And the ones who don't believe in experts at all, you've got to do contact through local people, like pastors, pharmacists, things like this. They don't believe expertise. I think the other big thing, which we can get into in more detail, is trust is based on ability, dependability, integrity, purpose, and relevance. And if you don't do interesting and important actions, you're not relevant. People don't consider you. So if you're Ajinomoto, you take on hate against Asians, and people consider you, and they recognize that anti-Asian hate is despicable. And if you're a brand and speak up for your restaurateurs and others who are selling Chinese food, you're going to see a sales increase. And that's the important thing. Trust drives growth, and action enables trust.
Well, when we sat down to do this report this year, Richard asked us a very important question, which he tends to ask us every year, which is, really, what has changed? What's different this year? And our answer was, well, everything is different. You know, the world has changed, people's mindsets have changed, and psyches, and their behavior has changed, and that has a tremendous impact on how they relate to brands. And one of our hallmark findings this year is that there's been a collapse of the purchase funnel. So we wanted to talk about that a little bit because today's buying dynamic is so much more modern and dimensional than what the funnel can really accommodate for. And one of the things that we found is that most research is actually happening on a brand after the first purchase. And that very linear way of thinking from attraction all the way down to purchase looks much more like a loop now, where attraction and awareness are really fueling engagement, and that strengthens trust over time. So it's very much a say and a do that happens, and we have to think about that. We have to measure that much differently, and we have to think about who's influencing that all along the way as well.
So I would also tell you there's a much increased spike of nationalism, that if you are, as an instance, a certain Asian country trying to sell in a certain Western country, you're going to have a hell of a hard time right now. 75% of the respondents said, I refuse to buy brands from country X because people are nationalistic, and that matters. People are also afraid. They're afraid of global conflict. They're afraid of inflation, and most of all, they're afraid of horrible environment. So these are at the highest level. And in about an hour, we're going to release some findings on a sustainability poll. All the things you think about marketing and sustainability are false. Specifically, that it's better educated, higher income, and women and young who care about sustainability. That is false. That is manifestly false. We can actually show something like a 25-point jump in purchase consideration if you put sustainability into your marketing messages. But the how has to be about you as opposed to about the globe. It has to be non-scientific. It has to be easily understood, and it has to be about saving money as opposed to be nice. People care about their money.
Yeah, and I think a big part of those sustainability messages are really the vulnerability that consumers are feeling now. I mean, it's sustainability, it's climate change, it's the smog I see out my window. It's a very visceral feeling, and we were very choiceful in how we sort of dimensionalize that with the consumer. A vulnerable consumer is a highly discerning one that's not going to be reactive but proactive. It's the best kind of consumer to have. And it's the best kind of consumer to engage with along their buying journey. So if you think about the way it's traditionally been sort of dimensionalized, it's always been about, again, the consumer, pushing the consumer down the funnel. What we've really tried to do here and bring to life is that very reciprocal, matrimonious relationship between a brand and a consumer. So it's not just a brand imposing its will onto consumers, but it is truly about that say and do and how that actually comes to life between that relationship.
So the question is the consumer belief driven? Is the consumer values driven? The answer is yes, deeply so, and arguably more driven by the Gen Z because they are maximally like this, 75, 80% push, and they're also activists in the workplace. And they're most listened to. That's the phenomenal thing. You should tell them specifics.
I will tell them specifics. So Gen Z has been very close to our heart for the last really couple years, but we're celebrating 1 year with our Gen Z Lab, which is basically 250 exceptional Gen Zers across the globe. And they've really helped us underscore and realize the sheer power of this audience. They are incredibly influential. Last year, we actually learned about their influence across every generation, from brands to social actions to how they act on the internet. This year, we sort of doubled down on their influence to purchase. And interestingly, we found that the biggest increase in that influence happened with the 59 plus group. That's crazy. It was up 12 points from last year. So even if Gen Z isn't your target, they're likely influencing your target. So you have to sort of keep them front and center. And they're such a wonderful generation. They're pragmatic, they're sensible, they're quirky. Who wouldn't want to engage with them? And we have a Gen Z lab that can actually help bring all of that to life.
So if you're here listening to a PR person, you probably want some view about brands and politics. And whether it's Target or Bud Light or Disney or like this. And we have some important things to say. One is be very careful if you're a brand right now at getting attention through controversy. The risk reward on this is dubious. Be careful. The second thing is there are a certain set of issues that in my country Republicans just find difficult. Gender, LGBTQ, those are not things that they want brands to be speaking up on. Democrats are fine across a whole array of issues, so it's political. Also, if you screw up or whatever, or if you misstep, say something quickly. Don't let it go. Because all that happens is it metastasizes, it's jumped on by people who want to make brands into political statements. Why is that possible? Again, because you have high fear levels, and brands are famous, and brands get clicks. And so if you associate yourself with opposing what a brand says, all of a sudden you're famous, and you go on the back of that brand. So stop it early if you're going to have an issue.
I'm glad that you brought that up because, when it comes to even our youngest generation, oftentimes we hear, oh, well, they're just all about cancel culture. And we actually find that our Gen Z audience, the one that's influencing essentially global commerce, we find is that they're more about accountability culture. You can mess up. Go ahead, mess up. We're likely all going to in our brand roles at some point, but take responsibility for it. When we talk about this trust loop that's replacing this collapsed funnel, it's called a trust loop because if you can sustain that that ongoing relationship between engagement and attraction, that's when trust is at its strongest. But there's a risk too, and that risk is when you don't know yourself and you don't know your consumer. When you're irrelevant, when you don't take responsibility for your actions, that loop can be broken as easily as it was given.
Also, by 3-to-1, that Gen Z cares more about safety and security than about fun. 3-to-1. It's just the opposite of what you presume about Gen Z. That's popping a balloon.
Yeah, and I guess the last thing that we would say is really the outcome of this new way of thinking about buying has also led to a new way of thinking about brand building. We have very much used the promotional roadmap to think about how we build brands. It's very much so about that intersection between corporate and brand, where reputation is becoming just as important, if not more important, in today's society as promotion. And so crisis can't be something that you just do when something goes wrong. It has to be built into your business model from the very beginning.
There are 3 factors that yield sales: price, quality, trust. 1, 2, 3. Trust is the third musketeer. Porthos, Aramis, and I forget the third musketeer. Anyway, trust for the day. But well ahead of promotion or place or all the 3 Ps that I learned in business school. Trust. And trust is at various points. Trust is at the initial purchase, and trust has to be earned, again, for repeat purchase.
So we've killed the purchase funnel, and now we've killed all the P's as well, which is sort of a fun place to be, right? But I guess the 3 things that I'd love to leave you with about our report this year is understand the sheer power and influence of our Gen Z audience. If they're not your primary audience, treat them like one. 2, there's been a collapse of the purchase funnel. It looks much more like a loop now, and so even how we think about purchasing and conversion has to change. And brand building is a mix of reputation and promotion.
And the last thing I would say is make sure that when you're doing a new campaign, have the CCO and the CMO in the room. It's not 2 separate functions. It is overlap between brand and corporate reputation.
Yeah, that's great. Did you want to do any questions or?
Sure. Anybody have any questions? Go for it. The big boss gets it first. He owns the place.
Hey there, thank you. Thank you, Richard and Courtney, for sharing those insights. I learned a lot. Have you addressed trust in media as well? I'd like to hear a little bit about that. And I don't know, do you have any sense of...
It's fairly tragic.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the least trusted institution. It has been for the last 4 or 5 years. It's below government. It's why? There's a perception that media chases clicks. That it's moved away from truth-telling to storytelling, and that it's got a bias. And so, in fact, the most credible source of information is now my company newsletter. But there's also a bifurcation about who is credible. Experts are trusted by a certain segment of society, and then you have the people like Michael Gove in the UK who say we've had quite enough of experts. And they reject experts, and they prefer people like themselves or friends and family.
What I will say, though, silver lining, because there's always one, is media is different than journalists. And, media might be distrusted right now, but journalists are a little bit closer to home. They're personal, they're deeply felt, and, that's why it's important to have those relationships and to know your influencers.
But that's why brands have to go direct. There's no media in the world that has enough audience nor enough trust level. You have to use your own channels. Yep, go back. Q2.
I love having this private audience because I'm curious. Do we see a change in the role that brands are taking, especially, for example, in light of Bud Light? Our brands have a lot of clout, they have a lot of influence, they have a lot of money. and they seem to have been, very, kind of assertive about certain things, and now they seem to be getting a little bit more tentative. What do we think about that?
So first of all, Bud Light could have happened to any of you. Any of you marketers could have. And your point about what are brands doing about platforms and others, I think they're working closely with Meta, Twitter, and others to ensure that there's quality information, because they don't want to be next to stuff that is problematic. And brands have a fundamental role to play in informing directly about their categories, but in supporting quality media. So I hope they exercise that muscle.
Yeah, and what's worse, doing nothing or doing something and getting it wrong? So I think our data would tell us that know yourself, know your consumer, and it shouldn't lead you astray.
I have been dying to ask you this question, Richard. As many of you know, Anheuser-Busch was announced as Marketer of the Year earlier this year. Since then, Bud Light has fallen from number 1 to number 2. There's been some issues. If they're a client, you can recuse yourself from the question, but what does Anheuser-Busch say on stage this week accepting the award for Marketer of the Year?
Well, you can see what they did say. And what they said was, we've learned a lot from this. It could have happened to all of you marketers. We don't want to be in divisive issues. We want to be in, drinking beer for cheers. And we're going around America for learning. And we're committed to fighting back and getting our market share back and having a good ad campaign and entertaining and amusing people with our ads. And so that's what they said. And I think it'll work.
Hi, Richard, Courtney. Thank you for this talk on the purchase funnel. Always good to know what you guys think. Courtney, you said something about Gen Z is very near and dear to your hearts. I know you guys have the Gen Z Lab. You said I think it was a year it's been going. I wonder how you think about Gen Z in relation to, you talked a little about sustainability, climate change. I know you guys have fossil fuel clients. Gen Z is going to be inheriting the world that is currently being wrecked by climate change. I just wondered how you square having Gen Z being very near and dear to your hearts, but still continuing to work with fossil fuel clients.
I'll take that one. So my view on this is we should work with companies committed to change and committed to better. There's a point of view, which it sounds like you have, which is we shouldn't work with fossil fuel companies. I don't agree with that. There's going to be a transition. Whether it's 10 years, 20 years, or 50 years, there's going to be a transition. And the companies we work with, such as Shell, are committed to that transition. You may not be satisfied with the extent of their transition or the speed of their transition, but that they're committed to alternative airline fuel, for example, I can tell you because we support that. And we're selling to airlines that exact product. And I think our job is to do exactly that. Push clients, be with clients committed to change. We've also walked away from work, such as Standard Bank in South Africa, where they wanted to put a pipeline across the southern part of Africa, which other banks walked away from as an institution. And we said, no, we're not going to do that. And they said, well, then you can't be our agency. And we said, okay, that's life. We can't be with that. So I feel entirely comfortable with our position on this. And I'm happy to talk with you afterwards more, because if you have a different view, I'm happy to get educated.
Thank you.
Hi there. Working in B2B, how do you see trust differ between B2B and B2C brands, if at all?
I don't, actually. I don't see a huge difference. I mean, maybe in execution, for sure, but I think part of the reason we get it wrong is that we don't treat people like people. Consumers are people, stakeholders are people, and trust is a deeply felt emotion that has a lot of power to yield a lot of growth. but only if you're simple and you treat people like people. So I would say, no, I don't think that there's too much difference. Do you agree?
I don't know. I think of B2B as the biggest business opportunity in the next 12 months. Immune to recession, food service, tech, under-competed. So that's where we're going. I like markets where other people are ignoring it. Let WPP not do that for a while.
In this year's research, did you look at all about how attitudes towards data use are changing and attitudes towards data-driven advertising are changing between generations? Because I know in earlier reports there'd been a notion that younger generations were more open to sharing data. Then we've seen other research saying that no, it's actually the opposite. They're more skeptical. And we're right now in a regulatory climate in the US where regulators, maybe not your average consumer, are really ringing alarm bells about what we call personalization, but regulators call commercial surveillance. So just wondering, have there been any updates from the consumer perspective?
Well, we didn't look very deeply into privacy. I assume that's what you're going at when you're saying data privacy. But what I can tell you is yes to both of your questions. They're very open to it, and they're also very skeptical of it, which I think is a very healthy relationship to have when you talk about Gen Zs. I actually think the big skepticism is more on the older generations from what we've seen. I think that the Gen Zers, from what we've seen in our lab and with our data, is that they're very savvy. They understand that when they give their data, they can actually track where it's going. I think where it gets a little dicey sometimes is when they can't track where it's going. So, I'll be interested to see how it shifts over time, and also how Gen Z influences the older generation towards that openness. And I think it's a great question, something we're going to keep our eye on.
Thank you.
One of my favorite ever former clients, Babs.
How are you, Richard?
Good.
I wanted to ask you, this is more of a question about Edelman, the company. So you guys have been around for, within the family for so many years.
70.
70 years. And
I'm not that old.
And in that time, you've had multiple different types of agencies come and go. Even the biggest of biggest are now, what is the secret? You guys have to, maintain your private holding of it, not being, bought up. And B, you're the standard for comms and PR in the industry, and you have been for some time. Give us some tips for people starting companies or smaller companies or even mid-sized companies hoping to have that same kind of legacy.
So 3 or 4. When you get knocked down, you get your ass up. The second is you got to stay hungry. I am out here hustling, and you got to do that every day. Whether you feel good or bad, you got to get up and go. And the third thing is have an inner state of zen, because when everything is crazy around you, you got to stay calm. And do not take a lot of money out of your business. It is a bad idea to have private planes and all this other stuff. Fly commercial, be with your people, be like your people, and work harder than anybody else. And then people will respect you, and they will not be jealous of you. They will be happy for your success instead of envious. And it's crazy that our firm's been around 70 years. My old man started with 4 people, and we have over 6,000 people now. It's stunning. I joined the company when it was $6 million. Now it's $1 billion. It's out-of-body experience. But every day you just keep fighting, man. It's how you win games. I see Joel Myers. That's what he did, too. Started a little thing in State College, PA, and look at you now. And he's still a Penn State fan.
All right, on that note, Courtney,
We're out.
Richard, thank you
Thank
guys
you for that
very
question.
much.
Thank you so much.
Very much. Thank you. What a treat. Guys, Richard Edelman, everyone. Thank you.